he found a ring in the sea, and the story behind it left him speechless. Do you believe a simple ring can carry the weight of an entire century of silence, pain, and forgotten love? It seems impossible, right? But what you're about to see will change the way you view life's small finds. An ordinary dive off the coast of the United States revealed more than a lost object. It revealed a truth hidden for generations. When Paul, an ordinary man, found a ring among the coral and sand, he never imagined that buried within it lay one of the most moving, courageous, and transformative stories you've ever heard. The kind of story that makes you rethink everything. What is true love? How far would you go to protect the memory of someone you loved in silence? This ring, which could have been just a piece of metal forgotten at the bottom of the sea, opened the door to a forbidden romance, a mysterious disappearance, and a battle for justice that spans decades. But this isn't just a story of the past. It speaks to you, to your life, to your choices. Because we all have something buried, an unresolved feeling, an unforgiven forgiveness, a memory we avoid facing. Paul could have ignored what he found, but he decided to listen. And that decision changed everything. What he discovered challenges social norms, reveals uncomfortable truths, and shows, with overwhelming sensitivity, that true love never dies, it just waits to be found again. This story isn't about luck, it's about listening, about emotional courage, about humanity. If you've come this far expecting a cute romance, prepare to be confronted by a raw, moving, and incredibly real truth. A story that will touch your heart, will bring tears to your eyes, but will also leave you with something few videos can, a profound inspiration to change your own story. Take a deep breath. The journey begins now. And I promise you, you won't emerge from it the same way you entered. The waters were calm that late afternoon. Paul dove unhurriedly, feeling the lightness that only the silence of the sea can offer. It was his ritual of connection, his escape from the noise of the world. As he glided between the rocks and shoals of fish, something unexpected happened. A subtle glow broke through the sandy bottom, right next to a coral reef. It was no ordinary reflection. There was a point of light there that seemed to beckon him. He approached, and as he brushed the sand away with his fingertips, he found an ancient wedding ring, delicately wrapped in coral as if time had tried to protect it. Touching it, he felt a shiver, not of fear, but of empathy. It was as if the object held not only metal and form, but also stories, memories, emotions frozen by time. He picked it up carefully, as if rescuing something sacred, and felt an impulse deep within him, a kind of calling. He couldn't explain it, but in that instant, he understood. This wasn't just a lost jewel. It was the beginning of a journey of discovery that would transform his outlook on life and the past. Back on the sand, his feet still damp and his heart racing, Paul observed the ring as if trying to decipher an ancient enigma. There was something about it that transcended material value. It was as if every detail whispered a story of love, pain, and overcoming. The aged metal, the marks of time, the aura of mystery, everything conspired to keep him from ignoring it. And he, a man of keen intuition and refined emotional intelligence, knew he needed to hear this call. The connection was too strong to be mere chance. There, alone on the beach, surrounded by a cinematic sunset, he made a silent promise to himself. He would discover the origin of that ring. The decision came not from rational necessity, but from a profound sense of understanding and responsibility. Something told him that this find was a missing link between lives, between times. And Paul, driven by curiosity and compassion, realized he was faced with a rare opportunity to give voice to a story the sea tried to tell, but the world forgot to hear. Carefully cleaning the piece when he got home, amid basins of warm water and antique toothbrushes, Paul noticed that the ring concealed a faded inscription, Ma, and a delicately engraved date 1923. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just old, it was historic. A wave of questions flooded his mind. Who was MR? What happened that year? How had a nearly century-old ring ended up at the bottom of the sea? His uneasiness was so great that he barely slept that night. The next day, with the gleam of determination in his eyes, he headed to the nearest town, where he knew he could access old records and perhaps find clues. It was the beginning of a true adventure. And the most interesting thing, he wasn't seeking fame or reward, but meaning. He sought hope. He sought historical justice. He sought the thrill of bringing to light something that in itself already carried resilience, courage, love, and above all, the power of kindness, of someone who never gave up on keeping his story alive, even when cast into the sea. The small-town library seemed frozen in time, with its tall shelves, the smell of old paper, and large windows filtering the late afternoon light like a period painting. Paul entered as if carrying a mission, not just curiosity. He knew that inscription, Mar, and the year 1923 could be the key to something great. He headed to the Civil Records Office and began rummaging through dusty notebooks, microfilms, and old newspapers. With each turned page, a breath of history. He saw marriages, deaths, baptisms, political disputes, and then names, so many names, but none that matched those initials. Even so, he was undaunted, because the search wasn't just for data, but for humanity. Behind every record, there was someone who loved, suffered, and fought. And with each frustrated search, Paul cultivated more empathy, more humility, more connection with something that transcended time itself. He wasn't just a detective of the past, he was a keeper of memories. And this awareness kept him going. Even when answers seemed distant. It was in this context that he met Madeline, a local historian with over 20 years of experience and a razor-sharp memory. With her soft voice and attentive gaze, she was one of those rare people who listen more than they speak and see beyond the obvious. When Paul told her story, she smiled gently and said, "You're not looking for a name. You're looking for an echo." The phrase resonated in his chest like a lesson. Madeline, with her intelligence and sensitivity, knew that official records would never capture the full emotion behind a ring lost at sea. So she began to explore other avenues: family albums, letters donated by residents, unofficial archives. And it was there, in a worn envelope dated 1925, that they found their first real clue: a young woman named Rebecca, surnamed Morgan, with a reference to a broken engagement. The initials Mayar began to make sense. And with them, the mystery took on deeper and more exciting contours. With each new discovery, Paul and Madeline felt they were opening a door that many would prefer to keep locked. But it was impossible to stop. The ring pulsed like an ancient heart begging to be heard. The year 1923 was marked by strange events in that region: a disappearance, a fire on a property, and a sudden change in the behavior of one of the town's most traditional families. Everything was beginning to fall into place. Rebecca's story wasn't just romantic, it was a story of courage, resilience, and confronting the social rigidity of an era marked by inequality and judgment. Paul began to understand that he was facing a case where love, forgiveness, and overcoming were powerfully intertwined. And more than that, he began to realize that his own story was connecting to that narrative from a century ago. The emotions, the dilemmas, and the gestures of generosity repeated themselves over time, as if the past were whispering, "Keep going. There's more." Madeline wasn't just a historian, she was a living bridge between past and present. Her eyes held stories no one else could tell, and her speech had the rhythm of someone who has learned to listen to the silences of history. When Paul met her, he didn't just find an expert, he found an ally. From the first coffee they shared in the library courtyard, they were in sync. Madeline listened attentively to the story of the alliance, carefully observed the object, and immediately recognized its symbolic value. "Sometimes objects tell more than people are willing to say," she commented with a smile laden with wisdom. And so, without much announcement, they joined forces. Paul with his thirst for justice, she with her experience in unearthing forgotten truths. Their collaboration was marked by mutual respect and a sincere search for truth. A friendship shaped by empathy and purpose was born, two distinct souls who found a common mission in altruism. As their research progressed, the two discovered old newspaper clippings, family records, and most preciously, oral testimonies from centuries-old residents. A woman named Joan, for example, said that her grandmother spoke of a young woman named Rebecca who loved beyond what was permitted and had her heart broken by circumstances no one dared discuss. The accounts, though fragmented, pointed to a story of intense but forbidden love. It was clear that this narrative involved more than romance. There was something dark, a social barrier, a latent tension between classes and values. Rebecca was the daughter of one of the most influential families in the region, while Clark, the man she fell in love with, belonged to a marginalized working class. Their fight was not just for the right to love, but for the right to exist without shame, without judgment. And upon discovering this, Paul and Madeline realized that the search for an alliance was in fact a search for historical reconciliation, an attempt to restore what intolerance tried to destroy. One rainy afternoon, rummaging through forgotten boxes in the basement of the old community center, Madeline found what would change everything: a sheaf of yellowed letters hidden among old books. They were Rebecca and Clark's letters, written with emotion, their lines wavering and poignant. They narrated with disarming sincerity the drama of two young people trying to survive the oppression of a rigid time. The words spoke of fear, yes, but also of hope, courage, and faith in the power of love. In one passage, Clark wrote, "If the world doesn't allow us to be together here, may the sea carry our story forward until someone hears us." Reading this, Paul felt a lump in his throat. It was as if that sentence had traversed time just to find him. Madeline wept silently. There, in that forgotten attic, they understood that they were no longer just rescuing facts, but souls. The story was coming to life, and what came next, they knew, would require even more resilience. As each answer brought new questions, and an even deeper secret began to reveal itself between the lines of the last sealed envelope. The attic was dusty, silent, and seemed to hold not just objects, but condensed feelings. There was something sacred about that forgotten space, as if time had chosen to rest there. When Paul and Madeline opened the old wooden chest, they knew they would find historical records, but they didn't expect to find the beating heart of the story. The letters, carefully tied with a faded blue ribbon, carried the symbolic weight of lives cut short. As they read the first, written by Rebecca, a feeling of emotion overcame them both. She described loneliness, her father's fear, and the suffocating social pressure. But she also spoke of Clark with affection, describing him as the person who taught me most about kindness, even when the world was cruel to us. It was impossible not to be moved. Paul felt as if Rebecca were there, whispering her truth. Madeline, always firm, this time wept openly, because there was humanity stripped of masks, status, or pride. Just the raw sincerity of two hearts fighting to stay alive. The following letters revealed Clark's side, full of hope and resilience, but also with visible traces of insecurity. He knew his love for Rebecca was seen as an affront, an unacceptable transgression in a society marked by class divisions. Yet, he wrote courageously, "If I could, I would hide you in time, where no one could reach us anymore," he wrote on one page. The text became increasingly dense as the threats approached. Clark mentioned secret meetings, pressure, blackmail attempts, and even a dark warning from Rebecca's father. The tension grew with each line, and Paul realized that the romance had ceased to be just a love story. It was an act of rebellion, a silent movement of resistance. The couple knew the risks but moved forward with faith. This, in itself, was a lesson in wisdom, because loving with fear and still loving requires a strength few possess. But it was the last envelope that provoked absolute silence. It was sealed, unlike the others. Upon opening it, Paul and Madeline found a short, direct letter written by Rebecca. "Clark is going to disappear. They said if I continue, he will be taken from me forever. I don't know what to do." The date was exactly 1 week before the disappearance. It was a desperate cry, a warning, and with that, everything changed. That note made it clear that the couple was under real threat, that there were forces interested in separating them forever. Paul felt a mixture of indignation and responsibility. Now it wasn't just about rebuilding a romantic story. It was a mission of justice, of redemption, of giving a voice to those who had been silenced. Madeline squeezed his hand and said, "Now we need to be even stronger, because what comes next will touch wounds that many want to keep buried." And with that, they understood they were about to enter the darkest and most sensitive part of the narrative, a part where love faced, literally, the threat of death. It was during a visit to his mother's house that Paul had an intuition. Rummaging through his grandfather's old trunk, the same one that had been locked in the attic for years, he found a leather-bound notebook. In it, his grandfather had recorded thoughts, daily stories, and the names of friends from his youth. And there, among notes from 1920 to 1930, the name emerged, Clark, the same Clark from the letters, the same Clark who had loved Rebecca intensely and bravely. Paul felt his heart pound. This couldn't be a coincidence. He read the passages carefully. They were short descriptions of outings, exchanges of ideas, and even mentions of conversations about freedom, courage, and true love. His grandfather described Clark as a man of integrity, with a firm voice, but with a look that was always sad, as if carrying the weight of an impossible love. Upon finishing, Paul felt a kind of emotional shock. His own lineage had been connected to that story all along. The past was closer than he had ever imagined. This discovery changed everything. The involvement was no longer merely historical, it became personal. And with it, a new feeling emerged: responsibility. Paul began to realize he wasn't just the investigator of a forgotten story. He was also the heir to an unfulfilled promise, to a complicit silence that had dragged on for decades. He felt he needed to somehow make amends, to show that Clark's legacy hadn't been in vain. And even more so, to give Rebecca the place of dignity that had been denied her. The emotional connection became even more intense when he found an old photo hidden between the pages of the notebook. In it, 2 young men, one of them clearly Clark, and beside him, a familiar figure. Paul's own grandfather, still very young, smiling. It was a simple image, but charged with meaning. It was evidence of friendship, of affection, perhaps even of silent collaboration. This spurred him to continue with greater initiative and courage, even knowing that the path ahead would be marked by resistance. Madeline was deeply moved by the revelation. She said, with the serenity of someone who has witnessed many chapters of humanity, "Maybe your grandfather protected Clark as best he could. Maybe he lived with the burden of not having done more." These words resonated deeply. Paul then decided he would not let the story end as it began in silence. From that moment on, every step would be taken in the name of truth, reconciliation, and understanding. Even if it meant confronting his own family, challenging established narratives, and touching on sensitive points. It was time to use generosity as a weapon, empathy as a shield, and honesty as a compass. And as he delved deeper into this ancestral connection, something illuminated within him: the certainty that the invisible bonds between generations carry more than memories. They also carry healing. And while he was preparing to expose this truth, he felt that Rebecca and Clark's letters were gaining even more strength, as if destiny was finally ready to open the curtains on what had always been hidden. As the story took shape and became more emotional, Paul and Madeline began to confront the darker side of collective memory, resistance. That quiet little town, seemingly tranquil with its colorful facades and well-tended gardens, hid a past that many preferred not to explore. Paul began to notice suspicious glances on the streets, hushed whispers as he passed the market, and even small, subtle gestures of hostility. The first anonymous message arrived in the mail: "Leave the dead alone." Written in letters cut from magazines, it looked like a scene from a movie, but it was real. Madeline, with her emotional intelligence and wisdom acquired over the years, remained calm, but knew it was a clear sign. Tackling buried truths required more than courage. It required insight, patience, and humility. It was like walking through a minefield, where each step revealed new pain, new layers of silence, but also new possibilities for healing. Paul, who until then had acted on the impulse of his heart, had to develop a strategy. He began documenting everything. He digitized each letter, recorded testimonies, organized timelines, and sought legal support to protect the material. It wasn't just an investigation. It was an act of preserving history, of respect for the truth. At the same time, he realized how the community's resistance was also a self-protective mechanism. Many elderly people in the town harbored memories they'd never dared share. Some cried when interviewed, others refused to speak, saying they don't disturb what's buried. Paul understood. Understanding, in fact, was his greatest asset. He knew he couldn't impose the truth. He had to win it with kindness, affection, and altruism. It was there, in the fertile ground of empathy, that true transformation began. And even in the face of threats, closed doors, and growing fear, he continued. Because he had discovered that the search for truth is also a journey of self-discovery and self-improvement. Madeline was clear at one point: "We will disturb, but we will transform." And they were right. Because little by little, people began searching for them. At first, discreetly. Then, more firmly. A man, a former city employee, revealed that there was a missing person report for Clark, filed under another name as a way to avoid scandal. A woman, with trembling hands, handed over a brooch that had supposedly belonged to Rebecca, saying she had kept it for 70 years, waiting for the right moment. The pieces began to fall into place, but with each revelation, the tension also grew. The story threatened reputations, the names of families still influential in the city. Paul felt the weight of responsibility as never before. He was no longer just a storyteller. He was now a guardian of a dangerous but necessary memory. He knew that the path forward would require more than proof. It would require integrity, intelligence, and above all, perseverance. Because when the truth begins to emerge, not everyone is happy. But it is precisely at this point that it needs to be told with even greater force. As the letters were translated into context, and the testimonies aligned like pieces of an emotional puzzle, it became clear that the love between Rebecca and Clark was above all an act of courage. In an era where the weight of appearances outweighed the truth of the heart, loving someone outside one's social class was seen as an affront, a silent insubordination to the invisible rules that governed community morality. Rebecca, raised in an influential family with a planned future, abandoned the comfort of predictability for the sincere warmth of Clark, a man of humble profession but with a grand soul. They rebelled not with shouts, but with choices. They broke with the world, not with speeches, but with affection. Paul read each account with teary eyes, and at many moments, it was as if he were standing before two martyrs of human sensitivity. He understood that there was not just romance there was resistance. And the most beautiful resistance there is the one born of love. Rebecca's father, Bruce, was a central figure in the emotional siege imposed on the couple. A rigid man with an unblemished reputation but a frozen heart, he saw his daughter's love as a direct threat to the family's prestige. He did everything he could to separate them. Forced separations, promises of a cut-off inheritance, constant surveillance, and even emotional blackmail. But the more he tried to stifle it, the more the feeling blossomed. And what was supposed to be just a youthful passion became a silent and meaningful struggle. Madeline once commented, "Bruce represents fear disguised as honor." And it was true. Many of those who opposed Rebecca and Clark's love acted not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of the new, of mixing, of emotional freedom. And this is where the story becomes even more moving, because it shows how much fear can imprison not only the lovers, but everyone around them. Paul understood that telling this story was also a way to heal these generational wounds, a way to make people realize that true love should never be fought, but celebrated. With each new document analyzed, with each clue found, the narrative gained greater emotional depth. And what struck Paul most was the timeliness of that centuries-old drama. Rebecca and Clark's story was the story of so many other loves silenced by prejudice, by social structures, by ignorance disguised as tradition. It was as if each letter were a living lesson in emotional intelligence, in humanity, in the wisdom born of pain. In one of the letters, Rebecca wrote, "If you take away our freedom to love, you take away our right to be human." That phrase echoed in Paul's soul. That was the heart of the story. Their struggle was not in vain. It couldn't have been. And because of that, each step of the investigation took on more meaning. It wasn't just about what had happened. It was about what still needed to happen: recognition, forgiveness, reconciliation. But little did Paul know that, even with all this emotional burden, fate would still reserve a tragic chapter and a pain that had yet to be revealed. The night Clark disappeared was etched in the town's collective memory as one of the darkest and most silent in its history. It was raining heavily. The wind rattled the windows, and thunder echoed like harbingers of something no one dared name. Rebecca waited for him at the agreed-upon location, a small cabin by the lake where they had so often dreamed of starting over, far from everything. But that night, Clark didn't show up, and he was never seen again. Rumors spread quickly. Some said he'd fled out of fear, others suggested he'd been taken, but no one spoke for sure. And those who might have known something chose silence. Rebecca, devastated, fell into an invisible mourning. There was no wake, no burial, no farewell. Only a void as dense as that night's storm. Paul read the records from the time with a lump in his throat. He sensed something was wrong, something unsaid. It wasn't an escape. It was more than that. It was a forced, deliberate break. A disappearance that carried more than pain. It carried guilt shared by many. In the days following her disappearance, Rebecca was isolated from society. Sent to a rest clinic, as they called it. She spent months away from the city, and upon returning, she was a different person. Quieter, colder, more distant. Madeline found medical records suggesting forced treatments, the use of sedatives a common practice at the time against women who disobeyed. It was the institutionalized way of silencing a woman who loved too much, who dared too much, who resisted too much. And Paul, reading this, felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and sympathy. How could they have allowed Rebecca to suffer so much? For simply loving? How is it possible that humanity, in the name of order, has so often crushed the freedom to feel? This thought pierced his heart. The city never spoke openly about the case. Rebecca grew old alone, refusing marriage proposals, living in the shadow of a vanished love. Her story became a whisper, and Clark's name, a kind of taboo. But there, in those forgotten subtexts, Paul found the essence of overcoming. Her silence was resistance. Madeline, when reconstructing the facts with Paul, often said, "What happened to Clark wasn't an accident, it was someone's choice." And with each new piece they uncovered, this hypothesis became more palpable. An intercepted telegram, a censored letter, an irregularly filed police report. Everything pointed to a silent conspiracy. The figure of Bruce, Rebecca's father, became increasingly shadowy. He had the means, the influence, and the motive. And in that society, a gesture from the elite was enough for a life to be erased from history. Paul felt the weight of injustice like a toxic legacy, but he also felt the privilege of being able to do something, of bringing light where before there had been only darkness. Clark's disappearance couldn't be just another unsolved case. He understood that, for Rebecca, each night without him was an eternity. And for the community, each year of silence was an omission. Time doesn't heal everything. But the truth has the power to free even the most forgotten souls. And what Paul didn't yet know was that an unexpected reunion was about to happen, and would change everything he thought he knew about that outcome. The meeting with John happened. Almost by chance, or perhaps by one of those coincidences that fate constructs with the precision of a master craftsman. It was during a local conference on historical heritage that Paul, while presenting an excerpt from the story of Rebecca and Clark, saw an older man raise his hand, visibly moved. "This Clark was my grandfather." The silence that fell over the auditorium was almost reverent. The world seemed to stop for a second. Paul stood up immediately. The two greeted each other with a firm handshake, but the look they exchanged spoke more than words. There was an invisible link there, an ancestral reconnection. John, upon learning the details gathered by Paul and Madeline, said he had always heard, in whispers, stories about a forbidden love and about the man who disappeared to protect someone. For decades, he had kept a box of documents, letters, and even a diary belonging to Clark, but he never knew if they were real or just family myths. Paul's confirmation made everything make sense. It was the reunion the story needed. That same week, the three of them gathered, Paul, Madeline, and John. The box was opened on an antique table in a small lakeside cottage, the same lake where Clark disappeared. There were newspaper clippings, black and white photos, documents with faded stamps, and pages handwritten by Clark. Passages like, "If I disappear, it won't be by choice, and Rebecca deserves to know the truth, even if I'm not there to tell." It brought tears to everyone's eyes. Paul felt goosebumps run down his spine. John, previously skeptical, saw in Paul's gaze the trust and integrity of someone seeking not fame or profit, but justice. Madeline, experienced, said something that sealed the moment. When the living give voice to the silenced, a new chance for humanity is born. The story was now almost complete. The pain still throbbed, but there was already room for healing. And the most powerful thing? The families, separated by prejudice for nearly a century, were now united by respect, empathy, and the need for reparation. It was at this reunion that Paul understood, with all the strength of his heart, that legacy is not measured solely in blood or inheritance. It is built in gestures, in the bridges built, in the courage to confront what was hidden. John's presence validated everything. Clark was not just a victim. He was a symbol of a generation kept silent, of a love that refused to die. Paul then decided that the next step would be public. That story needed to be told. It needed to inspire. Because it was no longer just the story of Rebecca and Clark. It was the story of all who have been silenced, judged, excluded. It was about the power of truth, of reconciliation, of intergenerational understanding. And as he watched John become emotional as he touched for the first time the wedding ring found at the bottom of the sea, Paul was certain the journey had been worth every tear, every threat, every sleepless night. But before this cycle closed, there was one final mission: to share this story with the world and allow it to transform lives as it had transformed his. The exhibition was set up in the old mansion in the central square, a once forgotten space, now transformed into a stage of memory and inspiration. Paul and Madeline worked for weeks on the curation. Every detail was thought out with love, understanding, and respect for the story they were about to reveal. The main hall housed the chronology of events with framed letters, restored photographs, excerpts from Clark's diaries, and even period clothing donated by descendants of the community. In the center, under a glass dome, rested the wedding ring. Found by Paul at the bottom of the sea, now the ultimate symbol of resilience, courage, and hope. Right at the entrance, a phrase engraved in gold letters read, "Love that defies time deserves to be remembered." On the opening day, hundreds of people attended. Elderly people who lived through the silent era. Young people seeking connection with the past. Families who hadn't seen eye to eye for decades. And there, amidst tears, smiles, and hugs, a discreet miracle took place, healing through truth. The public's reaction was profound. Many were moved to see for the first time the full extent of the pain Rebecca and Clark had experienced. People who had previously said, "It's none of our business," now wrote notes of gratitude and left flowers next to the ring. Local schools included the exhibition in their regional history curriculum. The press highlighted the story. What began as a solitary find at the bottom of the sea became a movement to value empathy, emotional intelligence, and reconnection with lost humanity. Paul and Madeleine began giving lectures on effective memory and historical justice. They received invitations to take the exhibition to other cities. And Rebecca and Clark's story began to inspire not only as a tragedy of love, but as a life lesson about altruism, about courage, about the power of kindness in the face of judgment. It was as if the city itself was finally asking for forgiveness. A collective forgiveness, silent, but full of truth. On the last night of the exhibition, Paul remained alone in the hall for a few minutes. He walked to the glass dome, placed his hand on it, and took a deep breath. He thought of Clark, of Rebecca, of John, of his grandfather, of everyone who was part of this silent and powerful story. He felt profound gratitude, humility too, because he finally understood that the role of those who find a forgotten story is to treat it with generosity, initiative, and wisdom. Beside, the exhibition's centerpiece was a new bottle with a new message. Written by Paul, it read, "May you, in finding this story, also find the courage to transform yours." And thus, a cycle ended. Not with a period, but with commas that point to the future. Because every time truth is released from the depths of silence, it spreads like light. And those who listen to it with their hearts never remain the same. And now that you know this whole story, answer me honestly, how many rings have you left buried in your own life? How many unfaced feelings, how many swallowed truths, how many opportunities for forgiveness and reconciliation have you ignored out? Of fear or habit? Paul's journey isn't just about finding an old gem. It's about having the courage to listen to what many choose to silence. It's about looking to the past and inward with the strength of empathy, with the gaze of compassion, with the wisdom of someone who understands that true love doesn't disappear, it endures and transforms. Now, the question is, what will you do with this? Will you let this story pass by like just another emotional video? Or will you use this inspiration to resolve what still holds you back? Maybe there's someone in your life waiting for a conversation, a gesture, a listening ear. Maybe it's you. The world already has too many voices speaking, but it still lacks people willing to listen with an open heart. And maybe, just maybe, this is your calling, to be the link between what was broken and what can still be restored. Because when we choose to act with honesty, resilience, and kindness, even the oldest silence can find its voice. If this story truly touched your heart, comment below, what touched you most? What would you take from this journey into your life? And of course, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Here, we tell stories that not only move you, but also spark change. Because believing in stories like this is also believing that good can still be done with courage, purpose, and love.